Hello and welcome to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole. The global opioid crisis has never been at a more critical level. What began in the 90s as an epidemic of prescription pain medication abuse has transformed into something much worse: the use of heroin and synthetic drugs like fentanyl. Today, we look at the way out of the crisis and how to find accountability for the millions who've been affected. Opioids have improved the lives of millions of people around the world who are living with serious illnesses like cancer and suffering from acute pain. But they've also caused one of the deadliest drug crises in history, especially in the United States, killing almost 90 Americans every day over the past decade. And for many, those responsible for the crisis are not doctors, but rather the big pharmaceutical companies pushing their products with multi-billion-dollar advertising campaigns. The truth is, prescription medicine is big business.
Anytime you go to a doctor's office for anything, there's a pharmaceutical rep in there. They were actually marketing opioid pain medicine as being non-addictive.
In 2013, 9 out of the top 10 drug makers spent more on marketing than they did on research. In 2016, researchers estimated that medical marketing reached $30 billion, up from $18 billion in 1997. And in 2020, Americans spent close to $330 billion on prescription drugs. The seeds of the opioid crisis were sown in the mid-1980s when companies like Johnson & Johnson and Purdue Pharma began promoting prescription opioid medication like OxyContin and oxycodone. Before long, doctors across the US were unknowingly prescribing a highly addictive drug to millions of Americans, resulting in a nationwide opioid crisis. And for many, what started with pills quickly became something much more sinister.
I started with opioid pain medication, and it's cheaper to do heroin. All the lines and boundaries that I said I would never cross. I'll never do heroin. I crossed that line into heroin. I'll never shoot heroin. I'll never have an intravenous habit. I didn't take long for me to cross that line as well. The road from an opioid painkiller, the end of that road is ultimately death.
In 2014, stronger synthetic opioids like fentanyl began entering the drug supply in vast amounts. And a year later, something happened in the US for the first time in a century. Life expectancy entered a period of sustained decline. The cause? A surge of opioid drug overdoses and related suicides.
I've lost a lot of people. Not everybody's an overdose, but you see more overdoses than you do suicides. And me especially. It's hard because 1 second you're having a good time, and then the next thing you know, they're lying on the ground.
Because of decades of opioid overprescription, an influx of cheap heroin, and the emergence of fentanyl, the situation in the US has continued to deteriorate. But it's only recently that Americans have started to get angry about the problem. The search for solutions has spread in many directions, one of which is probing the legal accountability of companies who supply opioids to the prescription market. In 2019, an Oklahoma judge ruled that Johnson & Johnson intentionally played down the dangers and oversold the benefits of opioids and ordered it to pay the state $572 million in the first trial of a drug manufacturer for the destruction wrought by prescription painkillers. In October of the following year, Purdue Pharma agreed to settle with the US federal government for a sum of $8.3 billion to end the investigation into its role in the opioid crisis. Purdue Pharma, owned by the billionaire Sackler family, has since pleaded guilty to 3 criminal charges. The Mortimer Sackler family maintains that members of the Sackler families always acted ethically and lawfully, and that the proposed resolution involves neither a finding of wrongdoing nor an admission of liability by any member of the Sackler families. So that's what representatives from the Sackler family have to say. But there are still big questions to be answered about the origins of the current opioid crisis. One man trying to find those answers is Patrick Radden Keefe, author of Empire of Pain, The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty. And he joins me now from New York. Patrick, where does your story with opioids begin?
Well, it really begins actually decades before the invention of this particular drug, OxyContin, which gave rise to the opioid crisis. It starts with this family, the Sackler family, who, going right back to the 1950s, had been involved in the pharmaceutical business and in pharmaceutical advertising. And so the first great Sackler fortune was actually made with the marketing of Valium, another drug, which became a big blockbuster, but also could be quite addictive.
Can you paint a picture for us of the scale and the gravity of the opioid crisis today in the US?
So yeah, the crisis dates back really to the advent of OxyContin. It was initially released in 1996, and it started slow and then really intensified. And so you had more and more people dying. At this point, it's tens of thousands of people dying every year. There have been different phases in the crisis. Initially, it was a prescription drug crisis, drugs like OxyContin, these powerful opioid painkillers. So a lot of people had an on-ramp, which was not buying drugs off the street on the black market, but actually drugs that were prescribed to them by a doctor in a white coat. Over time, however, you end up with this huge population of people who are addicted. The estimates are that today some 2+ million people in the United States are addicted to opioids. And a lot of those people, finding it more difficult to access the prescription medications that they started with, moved over to heroin, which is a chemical cousin of these opioid painkillers, and also to fentanyl, a very, very deadly substitute. So at this point, we have this crisis, which has been a quarter century in the making and has only intensified during the COVID pandemic, with numbers of overdoses and deaths actually going up rather than going down.
Most people have a visual image of an addict, the broken down addict in the alleyway with a needle sticking in his or her arm. Do you have a profile of who is taking these opioids today?
Yeah, part of what I tried to explore in the book is the images that we have of different types of drugs and who takes them. And certainly the Sackler family, one of their big defenses from the beginning has been to say, oh, there's nothing wrong with this drug that we're selling. It's not intrinsically addictive. The problem is the poor moral character of those people who abuse it. If they weren't abusing our drug, they'd be abusing some other drug. What I found was that this is really a caricature and not true at all. In fact, you have lots and lots of different people from every conceivable walk of life who have started using these drugs in many instances because they had pain, legitimate pain conditions, whether it was post-surgery or through some other chronic pain condition that they were experiencing.
We've heard a lot about heroin addiction, gambling, drinking, alcoholism, but opioids, this is a comparatively new problem, isn't it?
When we talk about the opioid crisis more recently, you're really talking about a period of time starting in the 1990s when these drugs had been prescribed by physicians in a pretty limited way. And this was true in the UK as well, that there was a tendency on the part of doctors recognizing the power of these drugs to want to reserve them for really severe cases of pain, cancer pain, end-of-life treatment type situations, in part because they were worried about addictiveness. And the sea change came in 1996 when Purdue Pharma launched OxyContin. And the big push there was this drug shouldn't be positioned as a kind of nuclear solution that a patient graduates to when other remedies have failed. This should be, as the company said, the drug to start with and to stay with. And in order to persuade doctors to do that, they launched a real marketing blitz to persuade the American medical establishment that these drugs were not addictive. What they would say again and again, and I've interviewed many of these former sales reps who went out and met with thousands of doctors, and they told them the drug is addictive less than 1% of the time.
I mean, you talked there about pushing the drug. I mean, I lived in the States for a few years, and I was constantly exposed to medical advertising. Doctors are saying, this is great, this is great, this is great. I mean, it's particularly common to American television, isn't it, medical advertising? Were the Sackler family behind that type of advertising, that kind of push?
They were, absolutely. I mean, the initial Sackler fortune was built on medical advertising. Arthur Sackler, the oldest of these three immigrant brothers who really founded the dynasty, or they were born in the United States. They were the children of immigrants. Early in the 20th century, these three doctor brothers launched a business empire, and it was based initially around a pharmaceutical advertising company that was advertising to consumers to some degree, though that was more difficult to do back in those days, but also very much to doctors. I think their initial perception was that if you want to sell drugs, it's important to reach the consumer, but you also really want to reach the doctor who's writing the prescriptions. You're quite right, though, that at this point, there's really no limit to the kind of pharmaceutical advertising you see in the United States, and it's a kind of a quite specific and I think quite troubling aspect of our culture. I was very amused a number of weeks ago when there was the big Oprah interview with Harry and Meghan, that a lot of British viewers were watching this on U.S. television, which is something they didn't normally do. And on Twitter and social media, you would see them reacting in real time to outrageous ads that they were seeing. And they said, I can't believe that Americans are exposed to this anytime they turn on the television. But this is sadly a fact of daily life here.
But you did at one stage call Arthur Sackler the Don Draper of medical advertising. I mean, for people who haven't seen Mad Men, what did you mean by that?
Well, he was this amazing guy. I devote the first third of the book to Arthur Sackler, even though he died in 1987. He died before the introduction of OxyContin. But my thesis really is that he created the world in which OxyContin could do what it did. And the way he did that was through a very intuitive and I think quite slippery sense of how you sell drugs. How do you persuade consumers, and more importantly, persuade physicians to prescribe drugs? How do you talk up all the therapeutic benefits? How do you downplay all the side effects? And Arthur made a great fortune doing that long before OxyContin was even created. And there were other aspects that I think were more troublesome. I think there were a lot of conflicts of interest. In his case, he owned a newspaper that was distributed free to doctors and didn't disclose that a lot of the editorial content in the newspaper was very favorable to the drug industry, which he had a big stake in, or that a lot of the advertisements running in the newspaper were advertisements for products that he had taken, prepared by an advertising company that he owned.
So how would you describe the relationship between the doctors and the pharmaceutical industry? I mean, you read about doctors going away on golfing weekends, you know, so conferences in inverted commas, but and the tax-deductible conferences as well.
Yeah, this was one of the things that I found most dismaying in my research. Is I think that there's a tendency, I certainly had a tendency growing up, to think of doctors almost like priests or rabbis. You know, you want to kind of put your fate in their hands. You trust them. They have access to a specialty that you don't. And you trust that they have your best interests first and foremost in their minds. What I found is that the industry, again and again, is a wedge between the doctor and the patient. That there are all of these ways, many of them quite subtle, quite pernicious, through which industry finds ways to influence physicians and change the way they prescribe. It was funny for me because I know a lot of doctors, and some of them would say to me, oh, I would never be, of course the pharma companies are always trying to influence us, but I would never be influenced by a steak dinner. You couldn't buy me a nice meal and change the way I prescribe. So Purdue Pharma, this company that marketed OxyContin, some years the company would spend $9 million a year just buying food for doctors. That was a line item in the budget. And you'd better believe they knew they were getting a good return on their investment for that $9 million they spent.
For many people, I think, Patrick, the first exposure to the Sackler name would have been the charitable side, the endowments to many museums, like the Tate Modern in London. These days, the Sacklers, or for a long time, the Sacklers kept their name away from their pharmaceutical products, didn't they? And they concentrated always on their more philanthropic approach. So that was a good ploy, wasn't it?
It really was. I mean, this was, I think, part of what drew me to this story in the first place is that I was aware of the Sackler name because if you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, or the Sackler Museum at Harvard University, or the Sackler Library at Oxford, or any number of other places, particularly in the UK, because so much of the family is actually based in London.
Well, there's a lovely bridge, to be honest, that was sponsored by the Sackler family in Kew Gardens in West London, very near to CGTN Europe.
There is indeed. I mean, it's impossible to make your way through the cultural institutions, particularly in London, and not encounter the name. It's everywhere you look. And so I was aware of them in that respect. And I thought of this just as a kind of another generous philanthropic dynasty with an unimpeachable reputation. Come to find out that the great bulk of the fortune has been made just in recent decades from the sale of OxyContin, this drug with a really poisonous legacy. And, it's funny, I talked about how the family has always specialized in marketing. And in some ways, I think the greatest marketing trick they ever pulled was to write the family out of the history of the family business. So you see the name on all of these cultural institutions and university lecture halls, but you don't associate it with the rather sordid business through which the family has made its money.
So how did the Sacklers react when they found out you were writing this book, The Empire of Pain? Because I'm told you and your publishers received dozens of letters and emails from a lawyer representing some of the Sacklers. Was that at the back of your mind as you were writing it, the problems or the possibility of litigation?
Yeah, I mean, it would have to be, right? I think it would have been irresponsible for me not to have it at the back of my mind, but I kept it very much at the back of my mind.
Did it frighten you off at all?
It didn't, not at all. On the contrary, it sharpened my resolve. This is a story about a family that has gotten away with it effectively over the course of decades. And part of the way they've done that, and this was a story I wanted to tell in the book, is by shooting the messenger. So there were journalists going back 20 years who said, there's a problem with this drug. This drug that they're making all this money selling is killing people. And rather than do what another company or another family might have done, which is take that seriously and not necessarily pull the drug from the shelves, but really do a little introspection about whether there was anything the company might have done differently in order to slow down the pace of death and destruction. Instead, what they did was they went after the journalists. They went after people who blew the whistle. So to see them do it again with me was not altogether surprising. But if anything, it intensified my sense that I had to tell this story in a way that was responsible and airtight, and hopefully in a way that cannot be expunged or airbrushed away by the spin doctors of the family.
How much has this story, this saga, affected the relationship between big pharma and the public? Has it shaken confidence in the medical industry?
It's a fascinating question, and it's one that I have given a great deal of thought, because in the background, as I was writing and then publishing this book, was this miraculous development in record time of these vaccines, which are going to save the world. And it's in some instances by the very companies that I'm writing about in a critical way. I tell a story in the book about a period of time in the 1950s when Pfizer was bribing the head of antibiotics at the FDA. And I published the book after I'd received my first shot of the Pfizer vaccine. It's a bit awkward for me in the sense that I think that people should have a healthy skepticism about the motives of big pharma and about the way in which the profit motive really dominates all else. And so I think it's a good idea not to be naive about these companies and what makes them tick. At the same time, I would not want that skepticism to tip over into a kind of alarmism that would mean that people would be vaccine hesitant, wouldn't go out and get their shots. And I think that the companies should absolutely be commended for having risen to the occasion and developed the vaccines in the way that they did.
How would you describe the damage caused by opioids to American society, medically, socially, politically, economically?
So David Kessler, who was the head of the Food and Drug Administration at the time when OxyContin was approved, has described the destigmatization of strong opioids that happened with the advent of OxyContin as one of the great mistakes in modern medicine. And I think that when you look at the legacy of these drugs, they have brought great relief to some people who suffer from pain, but they have also ushered in just an era of addiction and real carnage. And I've seen it, I hear all the time from parents who've lost children, from people who've lost loved ones, from people who've really struggled with these drugs. The costs are incalculable. I mean, by most estimates, the costs of the opioid epidemic in the United States are in the trillions of dollars. So there's really no sum, I'm afraid, that you could get back from families like the Sacklers and the pharma companies that were involved that would be up to the task. But I think it's been a devastating legacy, and one that this country is still very much reeling from.
Patrick, thank you so much for talking to us here on The Agenda.
Thanks so much for having me.
Coming up after the break, how does the scale of America's opioid crisis compare to the rest of the world? Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to The Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now. Welcome back to The Agenda. Before the break, we heard about the role of Big Pharma in the opioid epidemic, focused largely on the United States. But what about the scale of the crisis elsewhere in the world? I'm joined now by Dr. Jane Quinlan, consultant in pain management at the Oxford University NHS Hospitals Trust. Dr. Quinlan, we've heard how many in the US blame Big Pharma and its marketing power for the opioid epidemic. Is the cause the same in the rest of the world?
I think one of the main causes of the opioid crisis generally is a lack of understanding about different types of pain. And a misappreciation, the fact that acute pain after surgery or trauma, that is appropriate pain signaling that tells us that something bad has happened and reflects tissue damage and responds really well to opioids, is mixed up with chronic pain. And chronic pain is pain that goes on for more than 3 months with no clear reason for that pain, no ongoing inflammation, no ongoing tissue damage. And that represents a dysfunctional pain system that doesn't respond to opioids and has very different factors in its initiation and has a very different treatment at its heart. And by pushing opioid use onto patients who have chronic pain has been the major problem in this crisis.
So the differences in pain management weren't fully understood, or they were ignored in the rush to prescribe these opioids. Is that it?
Yes, I think you're right. I think initially there was an underappreciation by the medical profession in the 1980s and 90s that the messages we were getting from acute pain patients, or indeed from patients having palliative care for end-of-life cancer pain, where again there's an ongoing tissue damage, there was a misappreciation really that those patients did very well with opioids, and that message was then transferred into the chronic pain community by doctors. And it also became mixed up with an idea that addiction wasn't possible if you had pain there, and that is just wrong. But still, Big Pharma carried on pushing these drugs to non-pain specialists, to family doctors who possibly didn't understand the difference between these two conditions.
What, in your view, can be done to end this crisis, this epidemic? It calls for more regulation. There are always calls for more regulation in situations like this. But do you think that's the way to go?
No, I don't think so. I think we need to make sure that opioids remain available to patients who will benefit from them most. And that's the patients who have had surgery or who have had trauma and have acute pain, or who have cancer pain at the end of life and need opioids that are very effective for palliative pain. And we particularly see in lower income and middle income countries, they have very little access to opioids for those patients who would benefit from them most.
Is the downside of this opioid epidemic around the world that doctors now are increasingly reluctant to prescribe opioids? And is that dangerous?
I think you're right. I think I would hate to think that we would be impacting patients with cancer at the end of life, where we know that opioids are very helpful and very important, and also patients having major surgery. We shouldn't be too scared to use opioids, but we need to make sure we use them wisely and support patients in using them well. And I think, unfortunately, those lower and middle income countries where they haven't got access to opioids are looking at what we've done in the States and Canada and the UK, Australia and Europe, and said, well, thank God we haven't been letting our patients get opioids, because look what a mess it can cause. And I think that's a huge pity.
Dr. Jane Quinlan, many thanks to you for joining us on The Agenda.
Thank you.
Patrick Radden Keefe is right when he says this is a fascinating story. It's one I followed for many years, but it wasn't until I met a fentanyl addict, a middle-aged woman married to a high-flying American executive, that I started to realize how widespread the scale of the opioid addiction crisis was, and largely hidden too. She looked the complete opposite of the visual picture I and many others have of an addict, well-dressed, intelligent, and obviously affluent. But she left me no doubt she was an addict, and an addict like hundreds of thousands of others who had started their addiction with a doctor's prescription. Today, it's estimated that there are more than 2 million opioid addicts in America alone, millions more around the world. And a lot of those people are finding it increasingly difficult to access the medications that they started with before moving on to fentanyl, more addictive than heroin and a very deadly substitute. Today, we have this crisis, which has been a quarter of a century in the making and has only intensified during the COVID pandemic, with numbers of overdoses and deaths actually going up rather than going down. Some of the doctors who accepted big pharma hospitality may want to ask themselves some hard questions. The Sackler family has been compared in Congress in America to the Mexican drug lord Joaquin Guzman, with the big difference being that El Chapo is serving a life sentence and was forced to forfeit $12 billion. The opioid epidemic shows few signs of going away, may prompt further pressure on governments to introduce further regulations. So, Patrick's investigations have been published at a very apposite time, because what the world really needs is greater awareness of the opioid epidemic. And the recent International Day Against Drug Abuse has done well to highlight that. As we heard from Dr. Jane Quinlan, the medical profession around the world is also at last learning the lessons of the crisis in the US. And if nothing else, we can take some hope from people like Stacey Nichols, one of many former addicts who are now working to help others to escape the pain of opioid addiction. Don't forget, you can watch everything from past Agenda episodes and find additional exclusive content on our website, cgtn.com/Europe, or on our YouTube channel. And of course, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, @CGTN Europe. Coming up on a future agenda, the future of flight. We'll be speaking to the new Director General of the International Air Transport Association, Willie Walsh. But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the Agenda team here in London, it's goodbye.